Daniel Carson, a retired Marine with PTSD, and his loyal service dog, Rocky, face humiliation at Bluewater Grill when the manager, ignoring Rocky's service vest, demands they leave due to a no-pets policy. Despite Daniel's calm explanation and certification, the confrontation escalates, drawing judgmental stares and snide comments from diners and passers-by. Daniel, dignity intact, exits with Rocky, sharing a quiet moment on a park bench. As they reflect on their bond, forged in war's crucible, a group of Marines enters the restaurant. What unfolds next promises to shift the narrative, leaving everyone stunned. Join us at Incredible Stories to celebrate tales of justice and compassion, like Daniel and Rocky's. Subscribe now to keep these powerful narratives alive. Your support ensures we honor veterans and their loyal companions, preserving their legacy for all. Hit subscribe and share kindness today. Daniel Carson, a 62-year-old retired Marine, carried the weight of his years in the deep lines etched around his eyes that had witnessed horrors most could scarcely imagine. His silver hair, still clipped in a crisp military fade, gleamed under the afternoon sun as he approached the Bluewater Grill, a cozy seafood joint nestled in a quiet corner of town. A faint limp marked his stride, a lingering reminder of shrapnel and sacrifice left somewhere in a distant desert. By his side, as always, was Rocky, a Belgian Malinois with a graying muzzle and soulful, intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight into Daniel's heart. Rocky's vest, boldly embroidered with "Service Dog, Do Not Distract," was both a shield and a statement, a testament to the bond forged through years of mutual reliance. For 8 years, Rocky had been Daniel's anchor, his quiet guardian against the invisible storms of PTSD. The dog's training was impeccable, sensing the subtle shifts in Daniel's breathing, the faint tremble in his hands, or the tightening of his jaw before an anxiety attack could fully take hold. With a gentle nudge, or the comforting pressure of his body against Daniel's leg, Rocky could pull his handler back from the edge, grounding him in the present. To Daniel, Rocky wasn't just a service animal. He was a lifeline, a brother in arms who had saved him from more than just physical dangers. The dog had been by his side through sleepless nights, through memories of burning wreckage and the crack of gunfire, offering a steady presence when the world felt like it was closing in. On this particular Tuesday, Daniel craved the normalcy of a quiet meal. The Bluewater Grill, with its nautical decor and reputation for fresh crab cakes, seemed like the perfect spot. He requested a corner table, far from the clatter of the main dining area, where he and Rocky could fade into the background. Rocky settled beneath the table, his body pressed lightly against Daniel's feet, nearly invisible to the other patrons. The young waitress, her ponytail bouncing as she approached with a glass of water and a menu, offered a warm smile at first. But when her eyes landed on Rocky, her expression faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Without a word, she turned and scurried toward the back, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor. Daniel exhaled, stroking Rocky's head absently. He knew that look. He'd seen it before. People who didn't understand, who saw only a dog where he saw salvation. Still, he hoped it would pass, that he could eat his meal in peace and slip away unnoticed. But minutes later, a man in his mid-30s, sporting a manager's badge pinned crookedly to his shirt, strode toward the table. His face was set in a mask of disapproval, his lips pressed into a thin line as if he'd already made up his mind. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying across the dining room, sharp enough to turn heads. "We have a strict no-pets policy in our establishment. I'm afraid you'll need to leave with that dog." The words landed like a blow, but Daniel kept his composure, his gaze steady as he met the manager's eyes. Inside, though, his chest tightened, a familiar pressure building. He could feel the weight of curious stares from nearby tables, the sudden hush in the hum of conversation. "Rocky isn't a pet," he said calmly, his voice low but firm. "He's a service animal." Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out the folded certification, the paper worn from years of use. He held it out, a quiet offering of proof, but the manager waved it away with a dismissive flick of his hand, refusing to even glance at it. "Rules are rules," the manager said, louder now, as if performing for the audience of diners. "We have health codes to follow, and other guests might not be comfortable with an animal in here. From a nearby table, a woman in designer sunglasses leaned toward her companion, her voice carrying just enough to sting. "Exactly," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "A dog's a doyen, military or not." Her words cut deeper than Daniel cared to admit, slicing through the fragile armor he wore to face the world. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm, to not let the anger simmering beneath the surface boil over. Under the table, Rocky remained perfectly still, his training holding fast even as the tension in the air thickened. Daniel looked down at him, drawing strength from the dog's unwavering presence. For a moment, he was back in the desert, Rocky pulling him from the twisted metal of a wrecked Humvee, standing guard as bullets whizzed past. That dog had never flinched, never faltered, and Daniel wouldn't abandon him now. He raised his eyes to the manager, his voice quiet but laced with steel. "This dog dragged me out of burning wreckage," he said, each word deliberate. "He stood between me and enemy fire. I'm not leaving him behind because someone thinks he's inconvenient." The manager crossed his arms, his face hardening. "Then you know what you need to do," he said, his tone final. Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle over him, the humiliation of being singled out, of being forced to choose between his dignity and his companion. Slowly he stood, his movements deliberate, his back straight despite the ache in his leg. Rocky rose in perfect sync, staying close to Daniel's side, his head held high as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Together they walked toward the exit, the silence of the dining room pressing against their backs. Daniel could feel the eyes of the other patrons, some curious, some pitying, but none willing to speak up. Outside, the cool air hit Daniel's face, a small relief against the heat of his anger and shame. He paused near the entrance, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Rocky leaned against his leg, a subtle reminder that he wasn't alone. An elderly couple, who had watched the exchange from a nearby table, hurried past, their heads bowed as if ashamed to meet his gaze. The husband glanced at Daniel briefly, his eyes flashing with a mix of respect and regret, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. But they didn't stop, didn't speak. They'd been raised in a time when making a scene was unthinkable, and Daniel couldn't fault them for it, though the silence stung all the same. Near the restaurant's entrance, a group of college students lingered, their voices low as they glanced at Daniel and Rocky. One of them, a young man with a backpack slung over one shoulder, looked like he might say something, his expression torn between indignation and hesitation. But before he could, the moment passed, and the group moved on, their conversation fading into the distance. Daniel stood there, his hand resting on Rocky's head, feeling the familiar texture of the dog's fur beneath his fingers. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the manager's dismissal, the woman's callous words, or the silence of everyone else who had watched it unfold. Less than 2 hours later, the Bluewater Grill fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the quiet of judgment or discomfort. The door swung open and a group of U.S. Marines in dress uniforms stepped inside, their presence commanding the room. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, forks hovered over plates, and every eye turned toward them. The Marines moved with purpose, their polished shoes clicking against the floor, their faces set with a quiet determination. The manager, who had been bustling behind the counter, froze, his earlier bravado evaporating as he took in the sight. What happened next left the entire restaurant speechless, a moment that would linger in the minds of everyone present long after the day was done. The Marines' arrival wasn't a coincidence, and their actions would ripple through the small town, a testament to loyalty, honor, and the unbreakable bond between a veteran and his service dog. In the bustling heart of the city, a group of college students clustered together on a crowded sidewalk, their laughter sharp and careless. One of them, a lanky guy with a smirk, held his phone at an angle, discreetly filming an older man walking by with a dog at his side. "Check this out," he whispered to his friends, his voice dripping with mockery. "This old dude thinks his emotional support mutt is some kind of special forces operative or something." His friend, a wiry kid with a backward cap, snorted, barely containing his amusement. "Probably another PTSD case, spinning war stories in his head," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "My cousin's got an anxiety hamster. Maybe we should get it a tiny camo vest and call it a hero too." Their laughter spilled into the air, loud and unapologetic, as they reveled in their private joke. Daniel, the man they mocked, heard every word. His jaw clenched, the muscles tightening until they ached. But he kept walking, his steps deliberate and measured. The sting of their words cut deep, but he'd faced worse, far worse, under the blistering sun of Afghanistan, where bullets and bombs were harsher critics than a pack of smartphone-wielding kids. He didn't turn to confront them. There was no point. They wouldn't understand, couldn't understand, the weight of what he carried. His hand brushed against the coarse fur of Rocky, the dog padding faithfully beside him, and that touch grounded him, pulling him back from the edge of anger. Rocky's steady presence was a lifeline, a reminder of battles fought and survived together. Across the street, Daniel found refuge on a weathered park bench, its chipped green paint offering a clearer view of the Bluewater Grill, where the lunch crowd was starting to thin. He settled down, his bad legs stiff and protesting as he stretched it out. From the pocket of his faded jacket, he pulled a carefully wrapped tuna sandwich on whole wheat, bought earlier that morning from a corner deli. He unwrapped it with the kind of precision that came from years of discipline, breaking it in half with hands that still bore the scars of war. "Not what I promised you, buddy," he murmured to Rocky, his voice soft but heavy with regret, "but it'll have to do for now." Rocky, a German shepherd with a coat flecked with gray, took his share gently, his jaws moving with the careful restraint of a working animal trained for focus. His dark eyes flicked up to Daniel's face, watching for cues, always attuned to his handler's mood. The dog ate with a quiet dignity, as if he understood the unspoken apology in Daniel's words. For a few moments they sat in silence, the city's hum fading into the background. Daniel's thoughts drifted, heavy with memories he couldn't outrun. He reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out his wallet, its leather worn and creased from years of use. Tucked inside was a weathered photograph, carefully encased in clear plastic to protect it from time's erosion. The image showed a younger Daniel, his face bloodied and pale, lying on a stretcher in a chaotic field hospital. His eyes, half open, were glazed with pain and shock. Beside him stood Rocky, younger then, his fur matted with dirt and what could only be Daniel's blood. The dog's posture was vigilant, unwavering, as if he could shield his handler from the world's cruelty. Around Rocky's neck hung the distinctive tags of Bravo Unit's K-9 Division, a unit deployed to the unforgiving terrain of Afghanistan's Helmand province. Those tags weren't just decoration. Rocky had earned commendations that outshone the medals of some human soldiers, honors for courage under fire, for saving lives when the odds were stacked against them. Daniel's fingers traced the edges of the photo, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and sorrow. He saw the passers-by moving around them, oblivious to the silent bond between man and dog. They couldn't see the helplessness in Daniel's eyes, the pain that lingered like a shadow, or the way Rocky's steady gaze anchored him. "Kicked out again, aren't we?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible as he tucked the photo back into his wallet. The words weren't just about the restaurant that had turned them away. They carried the weight of every rejection, every sidelong glance, every assumption that he was broken, unstable, a relic of a war no one wanted to remember. Rocky, sensing the shift in his handler's mood, gently rested his head on Daniel's knee, a gesture unchanged whether they were huddled in a desert outpost or sitting in an American park. It was a quiet promise of loyalty, one that didn't care about borders or time. A young mother hurried by, tugging her curious child along. "Don't go near them," she whispered, her voice sharp with caution, as if Daniel and Rocky were something to fear. Daniel pretended not to hear, but the words stung, settling into the familiar ache of being seen as a curiosity at best, a threat at worst. He was used to it by now, the way people's eyes slid away from him, uncomfortable with the scars, visible and invisible, that he carried. He glanced at his watch, noting the time. Rocky's medication was due soon. The dog had taken shrapnel in the same blast that had torn through Daniel's leg, leaving them both with wounds that never fully healed. They shared pain management routines the way they shared everything else: meals, memories, the unspoken understanding of survival. As they sat, a city bus rumbled by, its side plastered with a bold advertisement: Honor our veterans. They fought for your freedom. Daniel's lips twitched in a bitter smile, the irony not lost on him. The world loved its slogans, its tidy tributes, but it didn't know what to do with men like him or dogs like Rocky. Rocky couldn't speak, couldn't tell the world how he'd dragged Daniel to safety under gunfire, how he'd stood guard through nights filled with chaos and death. He'd never abandoned his handler, not in the face of bullets, contempt, or ridicule. Daniel's hand rested on Rocky's head, his fingers sinking into the dog's fur. If you believe a four-legged soldier deserves respect too, he thought, his mind forming the words he'd never say aloud. Type ROCKY. 2 hours later, the Bluewater Grill was settling into the post-lunch lull, the clatter of plates and chatter of diners fading into a quieter rhythm. The door swung open and the restaurant fell silent as 5 men in marine dress blues strode in, their movements sharp and purposeful, like a unit moving in formation. They didn't glance at the specials board or scan for empty tables. Their focus was singular, unwavering. Diners paused mid-bite, a child pointed in awe, and a businessman lowered his phone, his call forgotten. The Marine in front, a captain with the name Macmillan stitched on his uniform, approached the host station with an air of quiet authority. He produced his military ID, holding it up with a steady hand. "I'm Captain James Macmillan," he said, his voice clear and commanding. "Commanding officer of Bravo Unit, 1st Marine Special Operations." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The captain's eyes swept the room, not with arrogance but with the weight of purpose, as if he carried the stories of every soldier under his command. For Daniel, sitting across the street with Rocky, the sight of those uniforms stirred a flood of emotions, pride, grief, and a flicker of hope that someone somewhere still remembered what they'd given. The Bluewater Grill buzzed with the usual lunchtime clamor, plates clinking, voices overlapping, and the faint sizzle of the grill in the back. But the atmosphere shifted when a group of Marines, their uniforms crisp and their presence commanding, stepped through the door. Their leader, Captain Macmillan, scanned the room with a steady gaze before his voice cut through the din. "I'm looking for Daniel Carson and his service dog, Rocky." From the back office, the manager, a wiry man named Carl, emerged, his face tightening as he took in the sight of the Marines. His eyes darted to the crowd, where several patrons had pulled out their phones, their cameras trained on the unfolding scene. Carl's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of the moment. They left," he stammered, his voice barely carrying over the now hushed restaurant. He could feel the heat of judgment from every corner, his mind racing with the realization that this wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. Captain Macmillan stood tall, his expression unyielding yet calm, a man who had faced far worse than a flustered restaurant manager. His voice, steady and resonant, filled the silence. "A couple of hours ago, Mr. Carson and his dog were here, and you turned them away." He let the words linger, their weight pressing down on the room. "Let me tell you who Daniel Carson is. Outside Kandahar, in the chaos of an ambush, he saved 4 men from my unit, pulled them out of the line of fire one by one while bullets tore through the air around him. And Rocky, that dog has more confirmed saves than most combat medics I've known. In our records, Rocky holds the rank of sergeant. He's been awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his service." The captain paused, his eyes sweeping the room, giving the gravity of his words time to settle. Patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman who had earlier muttered something dismissive about military dogs now stared intently at her water glass, her cheeks burning with a shame she couldn't expect it to feel. Her fingers traced the condensation on the glass, her mind replaying her careless words, wishing she could be undone. A waiter balancing a pitcher of water stood rooted to the spot, the pitcher still tilted as if time had paused around him. His heart pounded. He'd seen the earlier incident but hadn't spoken up, and now the weight of his silence gnawed at him. One of the Marines, a young corporal, held up his phone, his movements deliberate but his voice firm, with a quiet resolve. "We're issuing a notice to our veteran support network, statewide. 15,000 members will know exactly how veterans are treated at the Bluewater Grill. They'll have the facts." His words weren't a threat, but a promise spoken with the quiet conviction of someone who understood the power of truth. He thought of his own father, a veteran who'd faced similar slights, and the memory fueled his determination to make this moment count. Carl stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, his voice trembling. "There's been a misunderstanding. We didn't know who they were. We had no idea." But Captain McMillan cut him off, his tone sharp yet measured, a blade wrapped in velvet. "That's the problem, sir. You shouldn't need to know a man's service record to treat him with basic human dignity." His words struck like a gavel, and Carl flinched, his mind a whirlwind of regret. He'd been so quick to enforce the no pets policy, so eager to avoid complaints, that he hadn't even asked who Daniel was or why Rocky was with him. The Marines didn't shout or demand apologies. Their presence was enough. Captain McMillan reached into his jacket and placed a framed photograph on the counter with a reverence that made the act feel sacred. The image showed Rocky in full tactical gear, standing proudly beside his unit, his eyes alert and unwavering. At the bottom, the frame bore a single word, etched in bold letters: brother. The captain's fingers lingered on the frame for a moment, a flicker of pride and pain crossing his face as he thought of the bond forged in the crucible of war. Then, without another word, he turned and led his men out of the restaurant. As the door swung shut behind them, the diners caught a fleeting glimpse through the window of an old, weathered pickup truck parked across the street. Inside sat Daniel Carson, his shoulders slightly hunched, his hands resting on the steering wheel. Beside him, Rocky, his service dog, gazed out the window with a quiet alertness. Daniel's face was unreadable, a mask of stoicism honed by years of service and survival and sacrifice. He had no idea what had just transpired inside the restaurant, no clue that his quiet exit had sparked a firestorm of conscience. His thoughts were simpler, focused on the ache in his leg from an old injury, the comfort of Rocky's steady presence, and the question of where they could go next without facing another rejection. Inside the restaurant, the silence broke as a young server named Ellie, a college student with a freckled face and a quiet demeanor, moved with sudden purpose. She'd been working the earlier shift when Daniel and Rocky had been asked to leave, and the memory stung. She'd stood by, silent, too nervous to intervene, and the guilt had been eating at her ever since. Now her hands shook slightly as she grabbed a takeout container from behind the counter. With quick, determined movements, she filled it with the day's special: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, a side of green beans, and, on impulse, added a slice of pecan pie, her favorite of the desserts she served daily. She scribbled a note on a napkin, her handwriting uneven but earnest. "We were wrong. Please let us make it right." Tucking the note under the string, she tied the container shut and slipped out the side door. Ellie's heart raced as she crossed the street, the weight of the crowd's eyes on her back. She approached Daniel's truck cautiously, her breath catching in her throat as she saw him up close. His face was lined with the kind of weariness that came from carrying invisible scars, but his eyes, when they met hers, were kind, if guarded. "This is for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she held out the container. I'm so sorry for what happened earlier." Her words tumbled out, raw and unpolished, carrying the weight of her silence from before. Daniel regarded her for a moment, his expression softening as he took in her sincerity. He glanced at the restaurant where a crowd had now gathered at the windows, their silhouettes against the glass. He felt a familiar mix of resignation and resolve. He'd faced rejection before, and he'd learned to keep moving forward. But this gesture, small as it was, stirred something deeper, a flicker of hope that not every door would be closed. He accepted the container with a slow nod, a nod that held neither forgiveness nor judgment, just an acknowledgement that someone was trying to make things right. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice low and steady. As Ellie walked away, her steps lighter, but her mind still heavy with the weight of the day, she heard Daniel's voice, soft and warm, as he spoke to Rocky. "What do you think, buddy? Should we give them another chance?" Rocky's tail thumped gently against the seat, a measured response from a dog whose instincts had once guided soldiers through danger. Ellie's lips curved into a faint smile, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and resolve to speak up next time, no matter how small she felt. A week later, the Bluewater Grill bore a new sign in its window, its letters, bold letters, gleaming in the morning light. We proudly welcome all veterans and their service companions. Below it hung a framed photograph, a collage of military working dogs from World War II to Afghanistan, their eyes reflecting the same steadfast loyalty that Rocky embodied. The change hadn't come easily. Carl had spent sleepless nights grappling with his mistake, his pride warring with his desire to make amends. But the Marine's words had sunk deep, and he'd vowed to do better. The local veterans organization held a quiet ceremony outside the restaurant, a gesture of reconciliation and honor. A small crowd gathered, their faces a mix of pride and curiosity, as a veteran stepped forward to present Rocky with an honorary medal, its inscription reading, "Four-legged warrior, above and legion." Rocky sat at perfect attention throughout, his posture as disciplined as any soldier's, breaking position only when Daniel gave the release command with a soft, "Good boy." Daniel stood beside him, his chest tight with a quiet pride he rarely allowed himself to feel, his thoughts drifting to the men he'd saved and the dog who'd saved him in return. Children from a nearby elementary school had made cards, their colorful drawings of dogs and soldiers bright with crayons and gratitude. One boy, no older than 7 or 8, approached cautiously, his wide eyes fixed on Daniel. His small hand clutched a card with a lopsided drawing of Rocky, complete with a tactical vest and a shiny medal. "Does he understand when people say thank you?" the child asked, his voice small but earnest, his heart full of awe for the one who seemed larger than life. Daniel knelt down, his bad legs stiff but manageable, and met the boy's gaze. "He does," he said softly, a faint smile breaking through his weathered face. "Rocky knows exactly what it means." His eyes flicked to Rocky, who sat attentively beside him, and for a moment Daniel's thoughts drifted to the long nights in the desert, when Rocky's steady presence had been the only thing keeping him grounded. The boy beamed, his fear replaced with pride as he handed over his card, feeling like he'd just touched a piece of a hero. Daniel knelt beside Rocky, his loyal service dog, ignoring the sharp twinge in his stiff leg, a lingering reminder of battles fought in distant deserts. Words weren't necessary between them. Their bond spoke louder than any conversation could. Daniel's heart swelled with gratitude for the people around him, those who understood the weight of his sacrifices without needing him to recount them. Sitting in the quiet corner of the restaurant, he felt a sense of belonging, a rare comfort for a man who carried the invisible scars of war. Rocky, ever vigilant, pressed his warm, steady body against Daniel's side, grounding him in the present, far from the memories of explosions and chaos that sometimes crept into his mind unbidden. The restaurant itself had changed since that day months ago, when Daniel and Rocky faced a confrontation over Rocky's presence. The manager, who had challenged Daniel's right to have his service dog by his side, had resigned the very next day. In his place, he left a handwritten letter for the restaurant's owner, a woman whose own father had served in Vietnam. The letter was simple but profound, its words etched with humility. "Thank you for showing me what no law book ever could. Respect isn't about following rules, it's about seeing the value in others, no matter who they are." The manager's departure wasn't just an ending, it was a catalyst. The owner, moved by her own father's stories of sacrifice and struggle, took immediate action. She introduced mandatory training for every staff member, ensuring they understood the rights of veterans and the vital role of service animals under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But she didn't stop there. Her heart stirred by the memory of her father's pride and pain, she began hosting monthly community dinners, inviting local veterans to share their experiences. These evenings became a sanctuary, a place where stories of courage and loss were honored, and where Daniel and Rocky found a second home. At the restaurant, Daniel and Rocky always claimed the same corner table, now marked by a small American flag set in a polished wooden plaque. The inscription read, "Daniel and Rocky, Bravo Team Never Forgotten." It was a quiet tribute, but to Daniel it meant everything. Each time he ran his fingers over the engraved words, he felt a rush of pride mixed with the ache of memories. Comrades lost, missions survived, and the unshakable loyalty of the Mali who had become his lifeline. Rocky, with his soulful eyes and steady presence, seemed to understand the weight of that plaque too, resting his head on Daniel's knee as if to say, "We're still here." together. One evening, as Daniel sipped his coffee and Rocky lay curled at his feet, a young man approached their table. His hands fidgeted, his phone clutched tightly, but not raised to record. It was the same student who had filmed the confrontation months earlier, his video capturing the manager's refusal to accommodate Rocky. The young man's face was flushed with unease, his eyes darting to the floor before meeting Daniel's. "I deleted that video," he said, his voice trembling with sincerity. "I didn't want it out there anymore. And I wanted you to know my brother just enlisted. He's going to be a Marine like you. If something happens to him, I'd want people to treat him with respect, to see what he's given." His words faltered, caught in the weight of his own emotions, the fear and pride of a sibling sending a loved one into the unknown. Daniel's chest tightened, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding. He extended his hand, his grip firm but kind. "Then start now," he said softly. "Be the one who shows respect to others, for him and for everyone else." The young man nodded, his eyes glistening, and walked away with a new resolve forming in his heart. Rocky, though older now, remained as devoted as ever. His graying muzzle didn't diminish his alertness, his instinct to protect Daniel from the invisible wounds of PTSD. During one lunch, the sharp crack of a car backfiring outside sent a jolt through Daniel's body. His hands trembled violently, the coffee cup rattling against the table as memories of gunfire flooded his mind. Rocky sensed it immediately, pressing his solid frame against Daniel's leg, his warmth a tether pulling Daniel back to the present. The other diners nearby glanced away, not out of discomfort, but out of a newfound reverence. They had learned through the restaurant's efforts and Daniel's quiet dignity to give space to a veteran's struggles, to honor his privacy without judgment. 3 months later, Captain McMillan's unit, the same one Daniel had served with years ago, prepared to deploy again. Before they left, they sought out Daniel in a gesture that stirred his soul. In a small private ceremony, they presented him with a unit coin, a rare honor reserved for those who exemplified the spirit of their brotherhood, active duty or not. Daniel's fingers closed around the coin, its weight heavy with meaning. He slipped it into his pocket, where it rested alongside a worn photograph of his Bravo team, the faces of his comrades frozen in time. Both items were talismans, reminders of a bond forged in the crucible of war, a brotherhood that stretched beyond years and circumstances, unbroken by distance or time. On quiet evenings, Daniel and Rocky often sat on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The fading light painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, and in the stillness, Daniel's mind wandered. He thought of the desert's relentless heat, the earth-shaking roar of explosions, and the eerie whistle of bullets passing too close. But he also thought of the moments of humanity, comrades sharing a laugh, a hand on his shoulder, Rocky's unwavering presence through it all. The silence between them held a lifetime of memories, both brutal and beautiful, and the quiet assurance that some people still honored their duty to those who served. Not every uniform made a hero, Daniel knew, but anyone who stood up for a comrade, be it a soldier or a dog like Rocky, was no coward. Their story might fade from memory in a few days, lost in the noise of everyday life. But if no one retold it, if no one carried it forward, the lessons of justice, kindness, and remembrance would slip into silence. Daniel and Rocky, side by side, were a living testament to those values, their bond a beacon for anyone willing to listen.